again for coming. Today I'm going to talk about specifically some survey data that we've collected and some analyses that we've been doing, trying to understand why farmers are adopting certain conservation practices that are really aimed at improving water quality. Most of my work has been in the western Lake Erie basin, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the problems that are going on in Lake Erie, and even more recently that the federal government put out targets basically saying that we needed to reduce total phosphorus entering Lake Erie by 40%. And then went to the states and to the provinces and basically said, now you can put together, and so Ohio, for instance, put together a domestic action plan. Those are still being finalized as far as I know. Some of you here might know more about that than me. And the goal of those plans is basically to figure out how are we going to do our part to achieve that 40% reduction. So I've had the pleasure of working on a variety of interdisciplinary teams since about probably 2011, working on this issue. Back in 2011, we didn't have this nice policy target out there saying let's reduce phosphorus by 40%, so we didn't really know what we were working towards, but we did know that this was a complex system, and we needed to understand various aspects of the system to really know how to design policy that would be effective at the end of the day. So my job, as I try to talk, my job on these projects is really to better understand the farmer behavioral component of that, the idea being that when we design policy, those policy mechanisms, as most of you probably know, being in the Glenn College, do not just magically translate into the environmental outcomes that you want. There are people that kind of mediate those relationships, right? So they have to respond to those policies in ways that are, the person designing the policy, hopefully expected and predictable and desired, right? So that you actually get those kind of environmental outcomes at the end of the day. So a lot of my research is really looking at that kind of intersection, trying to understand how do individual actors respond to those policy mechanisms? Drinking some tea. And how might that influence then our ability to achieve those kind of outcomes at the end of the day, whether they're environmental, physical, ecological, right? So here's the kind of token you have to give the satellite imagery of the Great Lakes. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, but here we have western Lake Erie, where we've seen the most intense and most problematic harmful algal blooms. These blooms have been increasing in frequency and intensity, and that has drawn the attention of a lot of folks, in particular policymakers in the states and the provinces, Ontario, surrounding the lake. It's problematic for a lot of reasons. So like I said, these blooms are becoming more severe. And we do know from physical science that the blooms are caused by soluble phosphorus, and they have doubled since 1995. And so what you see here is just what those blooms look like. It's kind of disgusting. So here's somebody's foot, here in the bloom, and then on top of the fact that it's kind of gross and nobody wants to swim right in water that looks like that, or fish in water that looks like that, or live next to a lake that looks like that, or go to a beach when the water looks like that. The blooms can contain these harmful microcystins that pose a very big public health threat as well. So it's not just the aesthetic sort of impacts that can impact property values and recreational opportunities, but there are these direct public health impacts as well. So this is just showing you the western Lake Erie basin. Actually, this is really just the Maumee basin. So you can see the Maumee River here flows from about Fort Wayne, Indiana through Toledo into the western end of Lake Erie. That is where the majority of this phosphorus is coming from. It's the river, it's the tributary that is actually driving what we see with the blooms in terms of how frequent and severe they are. And you can see the landscape that the Maumee River drains. This is a highly agricultural landscape. So we know that this river is really driving the HABs in the western Lake Erie basin. We also know that 87% of this phosphorus is coming from non-point sources, particularly agricultural land use, right? Because that's the primary land use in this part of largely northwest Ohio, right? Some portions of Michigan and Indiana as well. What's also kind of interesting about what's going on in the lake is that the loading that's causing these blooms is occurring during just 10 storm events per year. So this isn't a case of kind of phosphorus slowly trickling out of the system on a daily basis or even weekly basis. This is really a function of storm pulse runoff, right? So we get these big storm events, approximately 10 of them a year, and that's when all of this phosphorus is being flushed out of the system. And so they can actually track, the physical scientists who are doing the modeling of this can track and see that that's where the majority of the phosphorus is coming from. So it starts to give us a bit of a target when we think about policy and human behavior as to what we might want to focus on to try to have a positive impact on the lake.
You say that during those 10 events a year, the phosphorus is flushed out. But at the time when there is no event, I could imagine, is it absorbed by the soil?
So it depends, right? So it's highly variable. But yes, so there is the potential for some of that phosphorus to be absorbed. That depends a bit on soil health. So one of the kind of focal areas is, in terms of conservation is also on improving soil health.
It stays on the surface, really. You say most of it is flushed out.
Yeah, and so that's one of the concerns. So one of the hypotheses that was out there when this first, when these kind of trends first started up again, was that back in the probably about the 80s, there was a big push for conservation tillage in agriculture. And that was a function of realizing that a lot of the nutrients that were getting into the lake during that period of time were from erosion. And so you were getting a lot of soil that was washing off of the fields, and it was taking that particulate-bound phosphorus with it. So there was a big push for these kind of conservation tillage or no-till practices. Unfortunately, what comes with that then is if you don't want to till up your soil, you don't want to disturb that soil to prevent erosion, the easiest way to apply fertilizer is to broadcast apply it to the surface of the soil. So then you've created this, right, it's this kind of one of these unintended behavioral consequences, right, that a well-intentioned policy to promote more conservation tillage then led to greater broadcast application of fertilizer, which means that fertilizer is sitting there kind of ready for an event to be washed off because you're not incorporating it into the soil. There's some debate, and I've been in some pretty heated, I haven't been in the heated, I've observed some very heated conversations between researchers about whether or not that phosphorus is being flushed off the surface of the field or through the tile, the subsurface tile drainage system. There are two different research teams who would give you very different answers to that question. And so we're not really sure yet if it's just washing off the surface or if it's flushing down through the soil into those subsurface tile systems. For instance, some people are even looking at, they have a special name, but wormholes. But basically you get these like little kind of mini tiles basically that go from the surface of the soil down to the tile drain. And so pellets of fertilizer can go right through those wormholes and then get washed into the subsurface system. So there's a variety of things that contribute to it, and I would say that we don't know for sure yet where exactly it's coming from, what the main driver is. And that's actually an issue that our college is working on right now, trying to kind of sort out what is the right answer to that question, because that changes the sorts of policy mechanisms and the sorts of conservation behaviors. But yeah, so it's definitely during these big storm events. So is it flushing out through the tiles, flushing off of the surface? We're not sure, but there is some understanding that there might be too much fertilizer sitting on the surface of the soil that's causing it to flush through one of those two routes. So clearly one of the first things that happen when these sorts of problems arise in the environment is typically people don't turn to the social scientists first, or even probably the policy scholars first. Right? They usually go to the physical science first and they try to figure out what's going on, right? What's causing this problem? What are the drivers? And so there's been several good papers published that have started to really summarize, here's what we know about the kind of physical status of this issue. So this was a paper in PNAS that basically says that what's going on in Lake Erie is a function of two things, right? Both trends in agriculture and trends in climate, essentially. So I mentioned this broadcast application of fertilizer. That's what that looks like. You can drive really, really fast and just spread these pellets out on a field, right? So then if your timing is kind of poorly chosen, those pellets could be just sitting there waiting to be washed off. So we do think that there's some responsibility that falls on agriculture in terms of their land management practices, but we also know that it's not just them, right? There's also things going on in the kind of weather patterns and what we expect as a result of climate change that's going to continue to make these even bigger problems as we move forward. So we know it's a function of these two things. We now have physical modelers, watershed modelers, who are then saying, okay, well, if we know it's a function of certain types of practices that are being used in agriculture and a function of certain types of weather patterns, in particular what we expect in the Midwest, right, is that we're going to have more of these kind of intense rainfall events. We're going to have more variability in rainfall, but when we get some of those events, they're going to be much bigger in terms of their intensity. And so we might have more of these big kind of washing events. So the watershed modelers who work on these things are then running scenarios, right? So they have these models that they've developed that can basically take a watershed and they can run scenarios and they can say, okay, well, what if we change the land use in this way? What if we change the land management in this way, right? So pretend we put a policy in place. Pretend that people wanted to do something different, right? What would happen? So there's a variety of teams that have been looking at those scenarios, have been trying out a lot of different combinations, trying to see what is that kind of magic combination of practices that would get us to this, what now has been put out there as a policy target, right? This 40% reduction in total phosphorus. And now the states and provinces are responsible for getting to that. And I want to say, and if someone in here knows, correct me, but I want to say it's a 40% reduction from 2008 levels. And I want to say the goal is to achieve that by 2025, but I might have some of those dates a little bit off. So again, people have been trying to figure out, like, what would it take to do that? So in this fairly recent paper, I think this was 2017, in Frontiers in Ecology and Environment, there were several teams that have versions of the SWOT modeling tool, which is basically a tool that can be used in agricultural landscapes to kind of model these different scenarios. There's a team at Michigan, a team at Ohio State, a team in Texas, a team at Heidelberg, I think a team at Limnotech, which is a private company. So at least 5 different teams of scientists who each have their own kind of validated and calibrated version of this model. And they developed scenarios and ran them across all these models and then kind of converged those models to figure out what are the suites of practices that if we saw these changes across the landscape, we could actually get to that 40% reduction, not just on average, but across the board. And so what they found was they looked at a lot of different scenarios. For instance, they even looked at if we took 50% of the agricultural landscape and just put it in grass. So when they did that, that didn't go over very well with some of the commodity groups and other individuals who weren't a part of that conversation. And they didn't do that to say that this is a policy recommendation, but it kind of came across that way, I think, to some people, that if you're running scenarios, then you're giving someone an idea, right, that this might be something we would do. So interestingly, even that scenario didn't get us to the 40% reduction. The only set of practices that got us to that 40% target were these 3 things here. So it was increasing the use of filter strips across the landscape. This would be grassed areas that go along the edge of a field that are really meant to trap any of that runoff that might happen, for instance, during a big storm event. Another was the subsurface application idea, right? So let's get away from spraying fertilizer on the top of the field where it can just be washed away. Let's get into the practice of getting it underneath the surface of the soil. And then the third one was having winter cover crops. This is just recognizing that our agricultural landscape, it does not act like a natural agro-ecosystem, right? So if you look at any sort of natural ecosystem, there's things growing, there's things planted, there's something there all the time. You don't have these bare kind of soils or these bare landscapes. And so the idea is to think about those agricultural landscapes in more of an ecological way, that something should be there year-round. So cover crops are something where you can go in after you harvest in the fall, you can plant those crops, and they can then hold that soil in place over the winter. They can cycle those nutrients, and that really improves your soil health over time, your soil structure, and also can, over time at least, reduce some of those nutrient losses. So these were the combinations of things that they found to be effective. I don't have the numbers up here of what actually worked best, but I believe they were assuming adoption of filter strips up around like 75%, which is really, really high. I don't do research on why farmers put filter strips in place, because that's purely a cost-benefit sort of problem. That's an economic question of how much is it going to cost to pay them to take land out of production to put these things in place. What I've been focusing on are these 2 practices, subsurface application and winter cover crops. That's for 2 reasons. One, those are kind of in-field management practices. Those are things that farmers would do on their existing fields. That can also have on-farm benefits. Right? So if I put cover crops in place and I manage them appropriately, I will get benefits that might reduce my inputs, might increase my yield, right? Would give me some of those economic returns that I would want as a farmer. Same thing with subsurface application. There's a farmer in one of our demonstration farms in Northwest Ohio, farms about 5,000 acres, and because he's a large-scale farm, he can afford to buy kind of big equipment. He went out and bought a subsurface implement, basically a strip till machine, which costs like $300 and some thousand, so they're not cheap. But if you're farming 5,000 acres, you can afford that, because by then switching to subsurface application of his fertilizer using this strip tillage machine, he is now saving around $100,000 a year in fertilizer inputs, right? So he's paying that machine off in like 3+ years. So it's kind of a no-brainer for someone at that scale. But for a lot of our smaller farms, that's not an option for them to invest in things like that. So there are some conversations being had from a kind of policy standpoint, or what are creative ways that we could increase access maybe to those sorts of tools and things so that other farmers can take advantage of that.
And I'm just curious, thinking about winter cover and filter strips, to what extent are those culturally acceptable? And I bring this up because,
Yeah,
you know, we
not
talk
very.
about no-till, right? And it took a long time to convince people that an unclean field was okay, right? Is there, like, are filter strips considered to be like really kind of crazy? And therefore, it's not just an economic decision, but it could be one that you don't want your neighbors seeing you put in filter strips?
That's a good point. I don't know, because, yeah, I haven't actually studied the kind of behavioral mechanisms around filter strips, so I can't speak to that if there's another piece. I wouldn't be terribly surprised if there is something more to that, which is why I think it's going to be impossible to get 75% of people to put filter strips in. So I've made that pretty clear to the modelers that I think this scenario is a little bit crazy and it's probably not going to happen. One, there's probably not even enough money in the current incentive programs to do that. Even if there was, the prices they might demand, right, because of other concerns they have about putting practices like that in place might be too high. So what I've been working with the modelers on is basically, and I'll show you an example of this, basically decreasing the kind of recommended number of filter strips, or the recommended kind of coverage of filter strips in the watershed, and trying to increase some of these other practices, because I think these are more sellable for a variety of reasons. But to your point about cover crops are still a little tricky to sell, and I can talk more about that in a little bit. But subsurface application is a pretty easy one.
Yeah.
That seems to be an easy one.
Seems to be the most.
Yeah, it's easy if you can get past some of the logistical hurdles. In terms of timing, access to equipment, you get small windows in the fall to get out there and do that. And can the contractors who are doing 50% of the landscape in terms of fertilizer application get out there and do, strip till in 2 weeks when there's a lot of questions about the kind of feasibility of it. But if we can figure out those challenges, that seems to be, from a behavioral standpoint anyways, the one that's going to be the easiest sell. Cover crops are highly risky and uncertain, and it's going to be real tricky to get people on board with that.
Wasn't there, I think it's called a conservation reserve program put under by the second Bush? And I thought that was, is that the same thing as a filter strip? It sounds like it.
Well, so
I think this is more for wildlife habitat.
Yeah, there's a variety of incentive-based programs. So there's CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, there's CREP, there's EQIP, there's the Western Lake Erie Basin Fund. So there's a variety of programs. They're all voluntary programs, but people can sign up for them.
Right?
Yep, and they're paid through tax money and various other incentives. But
Those aren't working?
they're working, but I think part of the problem of those is it's a preaching to the choir sort of problem, right? So you have very conservation-minded farmers who then will go sign up for the conservation programs, and they will put filter strips in place. They will put cover crops in place. They will take advantage, say, of programs that maybe would offset the costs, right, of new implements that would help them do subsurface placement. But it's not reaching the full kind of audience of farmers, and I think that's one of the challenges of those programs. But yeah, a lot of those programs are out there, for sure.
Just a factual question. A filter strip, you described, am I correct, as a piece of land where you have grass, so that the flow off will be limited?
Yep,
right?
yep,
So
yep.
that's not too difficult to put on.
They're
It's not about difficult.
Well, but corn prices went way up and people wanted to.
people ripped out their filter strips. Yeah, people ripped out filter strips and prices went up.
About this kind of a width of a strip around, is that enough?
No, that's not enough. So that's the other problem with
just
filters.
big.
That's the other problem with filter strips, is they vary in their efficacy quite a bit, and so they usually have to be anywhere from 15 to 30 feet to even be at all efficacious.
Oh.
One of the challenges of filter strips is they're not as great at storm pulsed runoff, because that's water moving quickly, and so they're not necessarily even going to capture that. You almost need wetlands, right, to deal with this. So I think there's a lot of questions on the filter strip side. Like I said, I'm not touching it behaviorally because there's a lot of reasons why I'm not touching it behaviorally. But to me, when you think about this issue in Lake Erie, it's basically a collective action problem, right? So you've got these costs that are being borne by people downstream. In terms of the environmental impacts, they're being caused by the people upstream who now are being asked to take on the cost to fix it, but they're not getting the benefit, right? So it's this classic sort of problem. So I think by focusing on the ways that we can show benefit, right, this is one of the ways that we can engage farmers in this from a solutions standpoint. And so I've been focusing a lot on those kind of infield practices, the things that don't require them taking land out of production, the things that should, if we can communicate it effectively and get the science up to speed on some of it, that should actually provide some of those economic benefits to the farmer.
And farmers
Yeah.
thought about a cooperative for that machinery that.
It's being talked about.
Subsurface.
Yeah, it's being talked about. So that's one of the things is can we establish these cooperative programs where there would be kind of communal access? Again, like I said, there's some problems with timing because the windows in the fall to apply the fertilizer are pretty small, and to do subsurface application of fertilizer versus broadcast takes twice as long. So you're going into a much slower method in a short window of time with not enough equipment to go around. So there are a lot of real challenges, but these conversations are certainly being had. Yeah, questions?
So the field drainage and tile drainage, a lot of that runs off into the ditch along the road.
Yeah.
Couldn't they put an aggregate in the ditch to absorb the phosphorus as it goes down the ditch?
Like biofilters.
Some type of,
Mm-hmm.
an aggregate or a plant, some,
Yeah.
I mean, that's where the water goes, down the ditch.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Or
there's,
gets to the creek.
yeah, so there is, and this is getting into the engineering side, and again, I'm a behavioral scientist, so I don't want to speak too far out of my area, but there's a lot of research on biofilters, two-stage ditches, which are other ways to kind of more carefully filter water that's coming into those ditches and those mechanisms. So that's certainly being looked at, but it's also not cheap. It also requires taking usually more land out of production to do it right. And sometimes it requires kind of cooperative decision-making between multiple farmers because a ditch runs between two different fields owned by different people. So those are certainly solutions that are being looked at, but probably not to the degree maybe that some of these other things are, at least at a first glance. But yeah, that's certainly in the realm. And like I said, they've looked at, in this paper you can see they looked at a whole suite of different things, and these were just the ones that seem to be having potentially the biggest net positive impact. All right. I'm not doing a good job at my minimal talking, so I don't lose my voice. So just to give you a sense of kind of where my research fits into this kind of bigger coupled systems problem, this was just a diagram we developed for one of our NSF projects, just kind of showing that when we're thinking about this issue in Lake Erie, when you're talking about the human system, first you have to think about like what are the likely policy mechanisms, what is the public going to support, what are policymakers going to see as feasible and realistic and practical given their context. Once those policy decisions are made, how are farmers going to respond to those mechanisms that are put in place? We tend to think about kind of three buckets of policy mechanisms. We tend to think about the regulatory mechanisms, well, I should say kind of two buckets, the non-voluntary, so the regulatory, and then in the voluntary area, we think both about kind of communication and outreach, and then also these incentive-based programs, recognizing that people still have to choose to participate in those, so they're still very voluntary. We then think about, okay, as farmers respond to these different mechanisms, how do those land management practices change? We then integrate that understanding of behavior at that landscape level, or at a field level, I should say, into these landscape models where we look at kind of changing land use and management across the bigger landscape. We can then model, like I showed in that last study, how the phosphorus that's ending up in the lake might increase or decrease over time as a result of these changes. We can then think about how those changes in phosphorus loading might impact the ecosystem services that are provided by the lake. And then ultimately, in a true coupled systems project, right, you would then loop those changing services back into that kind of policy analysis piece, right? Because if the lake is getting better, people should respond in a particular way to that in terms of what they want to do moving forward. The lake is getting worse, right? You should be able to look at those connections. We also then look at these connections under different climate scenarios. So are there certain policies that are perhaps effective at changing behavior in a net positive way for the lake that work in kind of best case climate, but maybe don't work in worst case climate, right? So we're trying to look at that variability in the future as well, so we have a sense of what might be most effective moving forward. So again, my part in this is really just to think about the farmer decision-making component. Can we increase adoption of the right practices, whatever those are? And like I said, we've got some ideas of where to start. And then what policy lever is necessary? Do we really need these kind of mandatory regulatory mechanisms, of which we've seen a couple be put in place already in this system? Or is there possibility for this kind of voluntary bottom-up sort of adoption of these practices through, again, either incentives or even through kind of more targeted outreach and education?
Robyn?
Yes, Rob.
Would taxes and user fees be categorized under behavioral or regulatory?
Taxes on farmers or the public,
Or,
broadly speaking?
Or on the phosphorus or on?
Yeah, so Eric Nisbet, who was on our NSF project, actually did a lot of public opinion research that looked at that. So yeah, I would consider that behavioral, but that's not anything I've looked at because he was looking at what would the public support. Would they support taxes? Would they want those taxes to be fertilizer taxes, which means the farmers are paying for it? Would they want it to be food taxes so that they're paying for it? So there is some research from this project on that kind of, I guess up here, right? The kind of policy and public side. Yeah. Just looking at if you want to have money to support these incentive-based programs, it's got to come from somewhere, right? And so we have looked at that a little bit on the public opinion side, but it's nothing that I've worked on. Yeah. But yeah, it's definitely behavioral. It's just the public, not the farmers. Well, it could be on the farm. Yeah. But the problem is farmers are minority, right? So at the end of the day, when we're thinking about public opinion, they have a pretty small voice in the kind of public opinion picture. And again, this is getting into the things that a lot of you probably do more than I do, but we haven't gotten into the weeds of kind of the agricultural lobby and the role of public opinion and all of those sorts of things. But we have looked a little bit at how the public feels about those different sorts of taxing mechanisms. And farmers are represented in that public opinion survey, but they're just going to be a smaller proportion of that kind of voice, right, in that survey. When we do our farmer surveys, we're just surveying farmers. We're not surveying the rural public. We're not surveying the urban public. We're surveying just farmers, land managers. So we've done a variety of surveys over time, and this generally the Western Lake Erie watershed. You can see here some of our research has been focused on the Maumee. Some has included the kind of broader Western Lake Erie watershed. And so the data that I'll be sharing with you today was a mailed survey of corn and soybean farmers. We only surveyed and we only selected farmers over 50 acres. That's because something like 50% of the farmers in Western Lake Erie farm less than 50 acres, which is only 2 to 3% of the acreage in the watershed. So we're not very interested in what they're doing on their acreage because it's not really going to tell us a whole lot about what's going on with phosphorus in the lake. So we didn't even sample from those under 50, and then we further stratified this last survey by farm size because we really wanted to get a good sense of what was going on these big acreage farms. Because ultimately, the decisions that they're making are going to have a much bigger impact downstream, right, than the decisions of some of these kind of smaller operations. So this was stratified by farm size. Response rate was about 30%. It's been slowly dropping over time because it's a terribly overstudied population of people, and I'm not sure what the solution is to that, other than I will say that I have colleagues at Michigan State and Purdue, and we've been trying to have conversations about how to collaborate more and to kind of stay out of each other's business if we can from a research standpoint. And then the irony of it is I actually grew up about like right here. My dad farms, and I was up there visiting the other weekend, and he's like, oh, I got another survey. And I was like, who'd you get a survey from this time? And it was someone from the University of Delaware. And I was like, come on, Delaware, like, stick to Maryland, stick to the East Coast, like, why are you surveying my farmers? So anyway, so it's tricky because they're being asked a lot to weigh in on these issues, and it's leading to some challenges with participation. So what I want to go through today is just a quick kind of walkthrough of 4 different questions that I think our data can start to address that I think is really relevant, again, to this kind of policy question in particular of how should we be engaging farmers. I'll talk a little bit about what factors I think are driving adoption of these recommended practices, specifically cover crops and subsurface placement. Again, I'm focusing on those for some of the reasons I already mentioned. I'll talk a little bit about what I think the likelihood is of voluntary adoption of recommended practices. So there's an individual at University of Michigan who does watershed modeling, who has written a piece for the conversation and come out pretty publicly saying that the only way we're going to fix Lake Erie is through regulatory action. It's the only way it's going to work. We've tried these incentive-based programs before. We've tried everything. It doesn't work. So why are we sitting on our hands when we know that's what we need to do? I'm not sure that I agree with him, so I'll show you some evidence that I think there's other ways to get there. To what extent can these factors be leveraged? So if we see differences in adoption that we could promote through these voluntary measures or voluntary metrics, would that actually lead to some of these changes in practice that we want to see? And then at the end of the day, would those changes even do anything in terms of meeting these targets for the lake? So would they get us anywhere near those kind of total 40% reductions in total phosphorus? So I will walk through data to start to answer each of those questions. So what factors are driving? This is just a snapshot, very descriptive, kind of snapshot of questions that we have asked at multiple time points in this locale. So we did our first survey back in 2012, then another 2014. These were different projects, and then the data that I'll be talking about mostly today is our 2016 data. But you can see that for some of the things that we have tracked over time, we've seen positive sorts of changes over time, right? So when we think about things from a behavioral standpoint, we're often thinking about what are those cognitions and those emotions, those beliefs, those factors up here in your brain, right, that are causing you to believe something is worth doing or not doing. And so we're trying to better understand what's going on up there as a way of kind of targeting changes in behavior. And so we see that concern about nutrient loss has increased over time. We see that people's belief that nutrient loss is going to impact profit and water quality is increasing. We see that awareness about algae issues in the lake are increasing. Familiarity with the 4 Rs, which is this kind of outreach program focused on getting people to think more about precision in the way they use fertilizer. That familiarity is increasing. Exposure to that information is increasing, right? So all of these sorts of things, right, that if you're a communicator or an educator and you're out there trying to increase awareness, increase knowledge, you would want to see these things increase. And we're seeing that over time, we are seeing kind of positive changes, right? So if farmers aren't acting, it's not for a lack of concern, awareness, knowledge, familiarity, right? It's for some other reason. It's not for these things. One kind of little highlight that might start to show us where the problem is we've looked at their perceived control over the issue. So do they feel like they have control over their farm's impact on water quality? Do they have control over even nutrient loss on their farm, period, right? So can I even keep nutrients on my field and on my farm? And if I do, is that even going to matter for this bigger collective issue? And what we see is no difference really in that perceived control over time. And these numbers are generally, again, kind of lower than what we're seeing descriptively for everything else here. So we're not seeing a real positive change, a positive increase in their perceptions of control. Yeah?
Sounds like they don't believe it's their fault.
Well, not necessarily. So I don't have these up here, but we have other questions about perceived responsibility. If you're willing to take additional action, and actually 75+% of our farmers perceive responsibility for the problem and are willing to take additional action. So I don't think it's that. And I'll show you some other data. This is just descriptive. I'll show you some other data that kind of explains what I think is actually going on.
I'm not saying it's their fault. I mean, just
No, you're right.
the other things. You know.
No, and some of them definitely don't believe it's their fault, right? So anecdotally, you get into conversations, and there's certainly a lot of people who are upset and feel like agriculture is being
It
targeted.
could be septic systems from all the people
Exactly.
that live out in the country.
What about the
So-
septics? What about the urban
That's right.
sources? Yep.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And as we know from the physical science and the physical data that it's not those things, we haven't convinced all the farmers that that's true. But to give them a little bit of credit, and to your point, it kind of isn't their fault because it's kind of the weather too, right? So I think that's the bigger, I think that's the bigger question.
Could you explain both?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because we're we've got studies that have been published saying like, well, it's kind of the weather, and then we turn around and say you need to fix it. Well, can they really fix it, or is this something they really have no control over because of the uncertainty of those the weather forecast, right? Because it was just a couple months ago now, I think, but there was a manure event. Someone had spread manure. I don't think it was in the Maumee River basin, but it was in Ohio. Anyways, they had spread manure, they had followed all of the rules, they had done everything right, they had paid attention to the forecast. Well, then there was this big unexpected rain, and all this manure flushed into the local streams, and there was this giant fish kill. There were just like thousands of fish that were killed. Again, when they investigated it, they realized that farmer hadn't done anything wrong. So there's some legitimate reasons for them to kind of wonder, like, can I actually do anything about it? Another interesting point, and I've actually kind of, what's the right word? Slap some people on the hand for saying this. Some of the engineers who work in this context will walk around with a peanut butter jar of fertilizer pellets. So imagine I'm holding like a Jif jar, and they'll say, all you have to do, right, to fix these problems in Lake Erie is we just have to reduce the loss of these pellets by about 1/2 pound per acre, and that's how much is in a peanut butter jar. That's not helping anyone feel like they have any control over the problem when you're talking about an entire field, and now you're being asked to reduce the loss of like 1 jar of peanut butter jar full of pellets from that field. Like, no wonder they don't feel like they have any control over it, because that's going to be a really big challenge. So again, I don't blame them at all for this. I think we know that farmers are, or their practices are partially responsible, and they know that too, but they're also well aware that there's other things here that they don't have a lot of control over. So we've looked at what explains kind of differences in adoption of these practices. So this is just a logistic regression model. Here we've got, I don't think this is working very well. Is it? There we go. Cover crops and subsurface placement. So the reference group here are the laggards. So these are the people who said, I will never use this practice, or I'm very unlikely to use it in the future. The innovators are the people who reported plans to use the practice in the upcoming field season. The future adopters are the people who said, I don't intend to use it, but I'm likely to use it in the future. So they're these people that are kind of sitting maybe on the fence a little bit, considering doing it. So when we compare the innovators to the laggards, or the future adopters to the laggards, a variety of things kind of pop up that aren't super surprising as potential predictors. But what I really want to focus on, and it ties into this last slide, right? We measured in our survey this idea of perceived efficacy. So we measured this in 3 ways. We measured their self-efficacy, which was basically how confident are you in your ability to implement this practice on the majority of your fields this upcoming season. So it was a sense of kind of my personal ability to do this. So taking into account cost and timing, right, and all of these sorts of things. We then asked 2 kind of different response efficacy questions. One was, how effective is this practice then at retaining nutrients on your field if you put it in place? Another was, if enough people did this across the watershed, how effective would it be at improving water quality in Lake Erie, right? So kind of individual efficacy, and then this kind of collective efficacy idea. So in combination, those are the kind of dimensions that are behind this concept of perceived efficacy. And what we see is that as an individual goes from, this is basically a median split. So if somebody goes from kind of having low to high perceived efficacy, you're anywhere from 10 to 15 times more likely to already be using one of these practices than not. And if you go from that low to high perceived efficacy, you are then about, 3.5 to 4 times more likely to be considering it than not. So we're seeing this positive impact of efficacy, right? As people's confidence in their ability to do it goes up, as their belief that it's going to work at a field and a watershed scale goes up, they're going to be much, much more likely, right, to already have the practice in place. And they're even going to be more likely to be one of these kind of future adopters, right, than someone who says, I'm just not even going to consider it. And we've seen this for other practices we've looked at as well. So there definitely seems to be this piece with efficacy that's really important. So the next question to me becomes, okay, that's all well and good, but like, the only way that you can go out and increase efficacy is if you have enough people who are sitting on that fence, right, saying, yeah, I'm willing to think about it, and I'm open to new information, right? Or I'm open to signing up for that incentive-based program to give this a shot, right? And if we don't have enough people in that critical mass, then there's no point in engaging in these voluntary programs, right? Then we might as well engage in regulatory action and something much more mandatory in nature. So we always assume in kind of communication and outreach, right, that if we're going to engage in some sort of communication effort, or we're going to promote some sort of incentive-based or subsidy-based program, then we're going to want, in a perfect world, a nice normal distribution in our population where a small number of people are already doing the stuff we want them to do, a small number are kind of saying, over my dead body, right, and the majority are in the middle saying like, well, I could be convinced, right, because these are the only people that are receptive to that. So back to this kind of point of, do we need this kind of, these non-voluntary mechanisms or voluntary mechanisms? If we saw a distribution, right, that was heavily kind of skewed towards negative, I would say it has to be mandatory or regulatory in some way, because you're not going to convince people who have very strong attitudes against something to change. It's just not going to happen. So to even start to think about any of these voluntary programs, we have to know kind of who falls in the middle here. Interestingly, a pretty good chunk of people fall in the middle, right? So this is just kind of breaking down adoption levels for these 2 practices. So in our 2016 survey, we asked, what did you do last year? And we asked them to report on a particular field that kind of represented their farm. And these were the adoption levels we saw in 2015. Here's the numbers for the people who said they then intended to use that practice again in 2016 on that field. Here's that kind of likely adopter category. So those people who said, I don't plan to use it, but like I could be convinced. Basically, I'm likely to do it in the future. So if we add these 2 groups up, right, we're in this 60% plus or minus for these 2 practices of people who I would argue are kind of in here, right? They're kind of sitting in that place where they're either already doing it, they're thinking about doing it, they could be convinced, right? We could increase their commitment to these sorts of practices. So that's good news from a voluntary standpoint. So again, I don't think it's an issue of getting farmers to do the right thing will only happen if we force them to do it or require them to do it by law. I think there are other ways to do it, and I think we have enough motivated people to potentially get to those targeted reduction levels if we can find ways to better build that sense of efficacy that they have around these practices. So can we actually do that, right? So if we increase efficacy, what actually happens to these adoption levels? So if we look at cover crops, about 38% of our farmers are falling in that kind of middle future adopter category. And so we actually looked at the predicted probability of adoption given increases in efficacy. So over here, this is basically what the adoption levels were at kind of baseline levels of efficacy. We then increased efficacy by increments of 10%, right? So if we increased it by 10%, what would happen? If we increased it by 20%, what would happen? If we increased it by 30. And so what you see here are the categories of adoption kind of shifting over time, so to speak, right? As we would hypothetically increase efficacy. And so what you can see here is if we know that 58% of our farmers are at least considering this practice, the question is how much additional efficacy do they need to get to those target levels? Does that make sense? And so what you see here is we would have to increase efficacy by about 90% to get to those kind of target levels of adoption based on those motivated individuals, the ones that we think would be open to these sorts of things. And that's a pretty big ask. That's basically doubling their kind of current levels of efficacy for cover crops in particular. So you can see this is the innovator line, right? So as you increase efficacy, the number of innovators kind of creeps up and creeps up and creeps up. What's interesting about cover crops is you have to get to almost a complete doubling of efficacy before you get this kind of spike in adoption. And that's probably because cover crops are a hard sell, back to Jill's kind of point. There's a lot of risk and uncertainty around implementing them. The benefits may only show up even 5 to 10 years down the road in some cases, and so there's just a lot of challenges around motivating people to change behavior when you're dealing with those sorts of trade-offs over time. So I'm not sure. I mean, I'm curious, and now we're doing this. We're doing field experiments to see if we can actually increase efficacy, and if so, does that translate into actual changes? This is just a modeling exercise, right? But we're in the field now actually testing that. And I'm skeptical as to whether or not we can do this for cover crops. Yeah.
How do you measure efficacy, or what, maybe what were your factors that you told the farmers?
Yeah, so it's a standardized scale of 0 to 10, and I'll show you a slide here in a minute that shows what the actual levels were. But like I said before, it was a combination of self and response efficacy. So it was a combination of your confidence in your ability to implement the practice, which again takes into account some of those kind of physical constraints or other things that might prevent you, economic constraints that might prevent you from doing it. And then it was this perception that it would actually work, right? So at a field and at a watershed scale. So will it work on your field? And do you also then think it'll work if enough people did it, right, that it would fix the lake? So we wanted to tease out, is the problem just kind of, to your point again, I think, is the problem just a belief that they can't really do anything about it? That doesn't matter what they do, that everyone else is going to mess it up, right? Or is the problem that they don't even think the practices work on their field? And it turns out from our data that they're skeptical of all of the above, right? So they're skeptical that they can do it successfully, they're skeptical that it's going to work on their field, and they're skeptical that collectively it'll solve the problem. So we see a kind of an efficacy problem, I think, across all of those dimensions, which is important because that tells us different things about how we might engage with them. So when we look at subsurface placement, just in contrast, there's a smaller number of people in that kind of ideal middle category, but the relationships are a little kind of neater and cleaner when you start to look at increasing efficacy and what that means for adoption. So again, here's our innovator group kind of increasing as efficacy goes up. We had said before that about 65% of our group was willing to consider this practice, either already doing it or willing to consider it. And so if we would want to get to that level of 65% adoption, we would have to increase efficacy by about 77%, is basically what this data is showing us. So it gives us at least kind of a target to say that if we wanted to change the way farmers think about this issue as a way of getting them to change their behavior, this is what it would take. The question is then, can we actually do this? And like I said, that's kind of what we're working on now in the field. This is what it looks like, back to your question of how we measured it. This is basically, so here's future adopters of cover crops, future adopters of subsurface placement. Their efficacy levels are hovering right around 5 on this kind of standardized 0 to 10 scale. We would have to get them up here into the kind of, 8 to 9 range on our scale. That's what those kind of percent increases would translate into. That's actually above the current innovators' efficacy. So when we look at our current innovators, the ones already doing these practices, they're hovering right around 7 on our scale of 0 to 10. And it kind of makes sense because there's some individual factors that explain why some of these innovators are doing this already. Some of them are more risk tolerant. If you saw on the previous slide for cover crops, when you have more education, you're more likely to be an innovator for cover crops. So there's other things that kind of explain perhaps why they're already doing these practices. And so the efficacy piece is maybe not as critical for some of them as it's going to be for some of these more reluctant farmers who are, again, on the fence is the best way to think about it, right? That they have to be convinced. So the kind of most interesting part of all this, in my opinion, here we go, is would these changes be enough to meet policy targets, right? So assuming we could go out and we can engage with farmers, we could change their perceived efficacy, that by doing that we would then see these increases in adoption. If we got to those levels of adoption of kind of 65%, which is where we think we could get with the motivated audience for subsurface placement, or 50+% for cover crops, would that get us anywhere near where we need to be in terms of the physical outcomes in the lake? So what we've started doing is combining this data with the watershed model. So I will do my best to explain what's going on here. So again, here on the x-axis, we have these increases in efficacy. We again, on the y, have this predicted probability of adoption. What you have here are those kind of innovators, right? So you've got the cover crop adopters right here, kind of increasing with efficacy. You see that spike that happens at the end. You have your subsurface placement adopters kind of increasing gradually over time. And then we've plotted those changes in efficacy and corresponding adoption against the metric tons of total phosphorus that would be reduced into the lake with those changes in adoption. Does that make sense? So we've basically taken the survey results and the behavioral data. We've then integrated that into the watershed model to run the scenarios at each of these efficacy levels and corresponding changes in adoption to see like how long does it take for us to get to those total phosphorus reduction levels that we would want. So that's what you see here, this triangle is the average total phosphorus load. This is back to the filter strip question. This is assuming 55% of the landscape in filter strips. That's an increase from where we are now because about 30% of the landscape has filter strips, I think is the estimate. So that's still an increase, but it's nowhere near the 75% increase that was talked about in one of the papers. And what we see is, here's that policy target, the reduction of about, I think, 860 metric tons. And you can see that by the time we get to this kind of 60 to 70% increase in efficacy for these two practices, we get to corresponding adoption levels of 56% and 30% for these two in particular. That gets us to that, below that target level, right? So it gets us to kind of initially where we'd like to be. So this is really our goal with these projects, is to start to think about what are realistic kind of estimates of how we're going to get to those decreases in metric tons of phosphorus, as opposed to just kind of making up scenarios and seeing what happens. And we can start that by looking at these motivated groups. And what we know is that, again, this 56% and that 30% for these two practices falls well within our kind of motivated audience, right? It falls well within the range of people who I think would be willing to do this if we can get the kind of incentives right, we can get the information right. I don't think that the regulatory mechanisms are absolutely necessary. So just kind of recap, what's the likelihood of voluntary adoption? I would say it's high. About half of our current non-adopters are willing to use the practices. So this isn't a case of having to force people to change. It's probably a case of us getting our act together a little bit more on what actually works, under what conditions, how to do it successfully. What factors are driving adoption? Across a lot of different analyses, we're seeing this recurring kind of theme of control, efficacy, confidence. And again, it's not just the collective action issue where they're saying, well, it doesn't matter what I do, right? Everyone else can mess it up. That we also see concerns about what even works at a field level. And again, that's not surprising, because I go to lots of events where I hear agronomists and others talk about their research, and you'll have and it's a guy, I was gonna say a guy, it's always a guy. You'll have a guy stand up and say, cover crops are gonna save the world, and if everyone would do cover crops, we would fix all of these problems. And then like the next guy gets up and says, yeah, no, actually, in the short term, cover crops are gonna increase soluble phosphorus loss, so they're actually gonna make it worse initially, and we're not really sure when they're gonna make it better. So if I'm a farmer and I'm sitting at one of these events and I'm hearing that, well, no wonder I don't wanna put these practices in place. So I think that we don't always have the science where it needs to be on some of these practices, and even where we know more, we're not doing a good job communicating that effectively so that they know for their farm and for their field what could work and what would be useful and what would bring those economic returns. And so I think there's a lot we could do there that would really motivate that group of people to do things differently. Yeah, so I guess that's it. We're kind of out of time because I always talk too long and we had some other questions. But next steps, we're starting to look at if it matters where the adopters are located. So we want to kind of be more spatially explicit about these models too, and see if it turns out that all 65% of those subsurface placement users are all in one spot in the watershed, is that going to change those physical outcomes? So this is a physical risk map, and it's just showing you like this is a low risk runoff area, this is a high risk runoff area. This is kind of a social risk map, so we've just aggregated by county the adoption levels. And so red is where we have like nobody using these things. So you could think about this fact that here's a really high risk physical area in the watershed, here's an area where nobody's doing it. If we targeted a lot of that adoption to this area, would that have a bigger net maybe impact on the lake? And this might get at this problem of half a pound an acre on average, right? Because I don't think that getting everyone to reduce a half a pound an acre on average is gonna fix the problem. I think we're gonna have to think about this targeting, right? And where are the real risk areas and where can we have the biggest impact? And then like I said, we're doing a lot of field experiments now, actually, one, assessing from a baseline standpoint if efficacy is even being impacted by current outreach and education. So there are long lists of people who are engaging farmers around these issues and assuming that it's having a positive impact. Not a lot of evaluation is happening. So we're out there measuring that. I can say that a lot of these efforts, according to our pilot data, increase awareness and knowledge, but don't increase efficacy. So that's kind of concerning that we might be out there spending a lot of time and money trying to promote something that's not really hitting on the right button, so to speak. And so then I have some partners who are willing to try new things. So using kind of the best behavioral science to say if we really want to increase efficacy, what's the best way to do that? Maybe it's not just to bring farmers to someone else's field and take them on a tour. Maybe there's other things that we could do. So we're trying things like integrating group deliberation into these field days. So there's a lot of research that shows that when things are very uncertain, that people need to have that kind of group conversation and deliberation to sort through that uncertainty. So we have some people that are trying that. I have a conservation district who's doing a planning and goal setting exercise for their farmers. So when they finish the field day, they actually go through this kind of goal setting exercise, so they have steps in place of how they want to get from kind of point A to point B, from not using cover crops to using cover crops. And there's a lot of research again that shows that even just thinking about a plan increases the likelihood of you following through on your intentions. But then when you physically write it down, it like doubly increases the likelihood of you following through on your intentions. So trying some of these other strategies. And so that'll really be the agenda probably for the next couple of years, is to see kind of what effect we're having through these different mechanisms. Yeah?
What about collaboration at an institutional level? Because you seem to focus much on voluntary participation. But I could see, if you consider this as a common tool resource, that a collaborative, not machinery in this case, but a collaborative where people recognize, wait a minute, we have a much larger objective here that is reducing algae use for all sorts of reasons, and I can be part of it, that you have a rule structure or something in place, because that's a huge river basin area. I didn't realize that. It's huge.
Mm-hmm. It's huge.
Right? But there is nothing that connects them other than that they are engaging in the same activities. I mean, there's no institutional collaborative,
There's not.
right?
There's not. So some of you probably know Ramiro Berardo, maybe that's at OSU. He's an SENR. He's a political scientist who does network analysis. And so that's actually what he's looking at a little bit right now, is trying to better understand what are the institutional networks and how do you deal with these the fact that there are no overlapping structures, right? Because most of the institutions exist at a county level.
So there is not, yeah, exactly. There's
They exist
no
at a county
watershed
level.
management system.
No, because the conservation
Yeah.
districts are at a county level, the extension agents operate at a county level, the watersheds cross counties, sometimes a watershed could be one county, it could be 5 counties. So there's no mechanism right now in place that really provides that institutional structure in an aggregated
There
way.
is experience with that elsewhere in the globe.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. And there's places even in the US where, so I have a project where we're kind of comparing Lake Erie to Lake Champlain. And the difference that's happening there is they're providing those institutional structures because they have a TMDL that they have to follow now. And so it's forced them to do things differently. But the question is for Lake Erie, what would it take for something like that to happen? Or what
Oh,
would
yes,
be the-
3 states, so, okay.
Yeah, so no, it's a tricky, from an
Yeah.
institutional standpoint, it's super
Yeah,
tricky,
yeah.
yeah.
In the 1970s, this was a big issue, and I remember they took phosphates out of things like detergents.
Yep.
dishwasher, and that seemed to have solved the problem up until maybe 5 years ago, maybe the first time I heard about it.
5
What
years ago.
changed?
Yeah, so that's the question, right? So, so when the lake was originally dead, there was a lot of things that cleaned it up, right? And a lot of that was actually Clean Water Act kind of controls on point sources and industrial sources. Yeah, so that was probably the first kind of positive move for the lake. There was then the kind of push for conservation tillage and ag, which reduced some of the soil erosion, so that helped. What we've actually seen over time in the phosphorus is that the total phosphorus levels haven't changed coming into the lake. The particulate phosphorus levels have gone down from agriculture, but the soluble ones have gone up. So we've seen a kind of swapping out of what's driving the problem on the agricultural side. So again, yeah, some of the issues have been resolved and just don't exist anymore. On the ag side, we fixed one problem and then created a new one. And so I think most of the physical scientists that are studying this would say we don't know exactly what's causing it. It's soluble phosphorus. It's an increase in soluble phosphorus, but why exactly and what's causing that big increase, I don't think they know yet.
Could it be climate change?
Well, that's the argument, right? Is that we're seeing these kind of increased runoff events.
The large rainfall at one
Mhm.
time washes it all out in one big.
And the lake is warmer in the summer, which is a more friendly condition for blooms. So it's definitely all of that, but I haven't heard too many of them come down very confidently, like this is exactly what's going on. Like, for instance, my example of, is it the fact that now we're broadcast supplying fertilizer, which is then being washed off the surface during a rain event? That's possible, but there's people who be like, well, we don't know if that's exactly what it is, right? So there's still some questions about it, but it's an increase in soluble phosphorus. It's coming from the agricultural landscape. It's coming through storm pulse runoff. That much we know. Exactly what those dynamics are and how we fix them, I think we're maybe less sure about.